Okay, so moving on to our next session this afternoon, which is around the panel will look at the uneven pathways and existing gaps that many disadvantaged students face when transitioning from higher education into employment. And I'm delighted to say that we have Professor Lindsey Macmillan, who is the Professor of Economics at the University College London, and we also were joined by Dr. Hollie Chandler, who is the Director of Policy at the Russell Group of Universities. So may I pass over to Lindsey first of all.
Hello everyone, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. Right, in keeping with being an academic, I can't possibly talk without slides, but I also want to show you some data, so bear with me. Hopefully it'll be illuminating and you'll see why. So I'm the Director of the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities at UCL. So as you could probably tell by the name, all of our work is really based around the area of the importance of education in closing the gaps between people from richer and poorer backgrounds. So I want to use this time to give you an overview of what the evidence tells us about how we fare in this country in terms of both regional, but also disadvantaged and ethnic inequalities in opportunities and the role of higher education in all of this. So I'm going to start just by giving you a snapshot of findings from a report that we did for the Social Mobility Commission a couple of years ago, called The Long Shadow of Deprivation. So in this report, we show that where you grow up in England really matters for your life chances. The map shows the average earnings in adulthood for sons and daughters growing up in disadvantaged families, so those eligible for free school meals. The dark regions are the least mobile and the light regions are the most mobile. In the least mobile areas, sons and daughters earn around 20 percentiles less than in the most mobile areas when they're adults. And for women in particular, least mobile areas aren't really clustered in any particular part of the country, but are instead spread across broad areas of Yorkshire, including Hull, of the East Midlands, including Nottingham, and the North East, including Middlesbrough. Whereas the most mobile areas for women include the inner London boroughs and some parts of outer London. So why do such differences exist across LAs? Well, people might expect this largely to be driven by differences in educational performances at school. Areas with strong educational performance for disadvantaged young people may also have stronger labour market outcomes for these people. And indeed, particularly for women, we find that patterns of mobility in terms of education of disadvantaged students in particular do look similar to patterns of mobility in terms of adult earnings outcomes for disadvantaged young people. Education, if you put it all together, can account for about half of the differences that we find in labour market outcomes across places for women, whereas for men, it only accounts for about a quarter of these differences. So educational attainment and gaps in educational attainment between people from different backgrounds are an important part of the story, but definitely not the whole story. So another way to illustrate this is to look at differences in outcomes for disadvantaged pupils from different ethnic backgrounds, which is what we do in new analysis as part of the IFS Deaton review. Now, there was a report a few years ago which was really focused on the challenges facing white working class boys, arguing that this group in particular are left behind in terms of educational outcomes. And you can see that in the data. If you look at the bottom line of the graph, what you see is you see that white working class boys are performing much worse than all other groups in terms of their education at age 16. All other groups outperform them, and women outperform men across all different ethnic minority groups. Black Caribbean boys also have low performance, while Chinese, Bangladeshi, and Indian women have particularly high performance. Yet when we follow these individuals through into the labour market, you can see that actually this group of disadvantaged, left behind white boys are actually earning more than almost all other groups. Indian and Bangladeshi men, here and here, are also performing well. But Bangladeshi women, for example, who were performing really well at age 16 in terms of their education performance, are doing less well. Indeed, the gender gap has switched, so women are now performing much, much worse in the labour market compared to men across all groups. So education isn't translating into a labour market outcomes in a clear way here. So what role does higher education play in this? Well, we know that disadvantaged ethnic minority groups are far more likely to go to university than their white counterparts. These graphs show higher education participation across age 16 test performances for each ethnic group. Disadvantaged white men and women, the black lines on this graph, are far less likely to go to university compared to every other group. Note also that Bangladeshi women are one of the lowest participating groups, despite their really strong performance in age 16 test scores. Black African, the light blue line, and Chinese, men and women, are by far the groups that are most likely to participate in higher education. But there are awarding gaps at universities, as shown by a recent report by Universities UK. So Black Africans in particular are far less likely to be awarded a first or a 2-1 at university, despite being most likely to go, relative to their white counterparts. And all other minority ethnic groups are also more likely to drop out of university too. When reporting on reasons for these awarding gaps, a lack of representation at British universities comes through as a particularly important reason why this occurs. So let me just summarise to try and stay close within my 5 to 7 minutes. We need to do better. The importance of reducing educational inequalities is an important part of this picture. There's evidence that if we do things in education, for example, if we offer higher bursaries, we can protect against dropout. If we use targeted information campaigns, we can increase higher education participation. And interestingly, I think universities are really now taking seriously not just the widening participation element of this story, but also the student retention element of this story too. For example, UCL just set up a Student Access and Success Committee, which is really broadening their remit beyond just focusing on getting people in the door. It's thinking about keeping them there for those 3 years too. Yeah, I just want to end with a kind of more broad point that in order to really level up, I think education policy alone is obviously not going to be enough. That's why I guess your commission is focusing on a much wider range of things than just this particular session. But descriptive analysis from our Social Mobility Commission report shows that areas that have less opportunities, less equal opportunities, while they have fewer outstanding schools, they also have fewer high-paying jobs and far greater levels of deprivation. And I think this links a bit to Jo's point that she made about, the wider structures, the wider social security net that we need to also think about when we're trying to think about how we're going to help people to get on in life. And I think more broadly, just to finish up, an education and skills strategy needs to be fully aligned with the industrial strategy, which I don't think we've ever quite got right. But it seems vital here, I think, for breaking down barriers to opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed, Lindsey. Can I now move to Dr. Hollie Chandler? Hi, Hollie. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. So I'm Director of Policy at the Russell Group, which represents 24 research-intensive universities across the UK. And our universities are acutely aware of the impact that access to high-quality higher education can have on employment opportunities and social mobility. Because of this, they all have plans in place to improve access and participation of the most disadvantaged students to our universities. Collectively, they commit significant funds. So our members in England invest over £500 million each year, and that equates to more than £1,600 per student. Now that money goes towards initiatives that aim to improve access, but also ensuring these students are supported during their studies to achieve the best possible outcomes, which is what Lindsey just touched on in some of her talk as well. So these initiatives, there is data to suggest that these initiatives are working. So when we look at students coming to us from those areas of the UK that are least represented in higher education, the proportion starting full-time undergraduate courses at English Russell Group universities is increasing each year. So more students from disadvantaged backgrounds are getting the opportunity to study at our universities, although the rates are still lower than the most advantaged students. So the ratio in 2021, for example, was 5:1, and that is an improvement on a ratio of 1 to 6.7 in 2018. So whilst progress has been made, there's still a significant difference there. Data also shows that the support we're providing to students during their studies is working. So students from disadvantaged backgrounds studying with us are more likely to complete their degree and progress to further study or highly skilled employment than similar students studying at non-Russell Group universities. Indeed, 75% of the students from the least represented areas at our universities go on to further study or highly skilled employment within 15 months of graduating. But there are still gaps in outcomes between those students coming to us from the most and the least advantaged areas of the country. So there is more that needs to be done, both to improve access, but also to ensure successful outcomes from higher education for all students. Now, as I mentioned, all of our members have plans in place to make progress. And we recently published an update to our report, Pathways for Potential, which described some of the initiatives in place. But a few examples include many of our universities have outreach programs with local schools and colleges, as well as dedicated programs for the most disadvantaged students applying to study with us. So those can involve help with their application or a contextual grade offer for admissions, bursaries, and dedicated advisors to support them during their studies. And some examples include the Bristol Scholars, Durham's Progression Programme, and Leeds Plus Programme. And as I mentioned, some of these are also captured in our Pathways for Potential report. But one of the things that's incredibly challenging is identifying the students most in need and targeting the right support to them at the right time. Unfortunately, our universities have limited data on the student's background available to them, for example, to be able to use that data in admissions decisions. So one of our calls to government is to work for them to work with UCAS to make more government verified data available to universities to inform admissions decisions and also help target academic and financial student support. I just wanted to finish by talking a bit about pandemic and cost of living impact on students. Unfortunately, it's probably no surprise to you that we're seeing increased financial, mental health and academic support needs from students as a result of the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. And this is only likely to worsen given inflation rates, and of course is going to impact and is impacting the most disadvantaged the hardest. So our universities have invested tens of millions in additional hardship funding and other financial help. So that includes adjusting bursaries for household income thresholds, providing one-off payments, subsidising food on campus, running local shuttle buses to reduce travel costs, and providing bursaries for learning resources. But the real problem is that these impacts are being felt by the majority of students. So this is a systemic problem, and that needs a systemic solution in the form of increased government. So we know that 1 in 4 students regularly go without food and other necessities because they cannot afford them. And that rises to 3 in 10 for students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And that was a survey carried out by the Russell Group Student Union Network. And 76% of students feel that the cost of living crisis has affected their studies, and the proportion in paid employment is now 55%, and that has increased from 45% in just 1 year. There's a really stark increase there. So pressure on students is only likely to grow next academic year as rates of inflation and food inflation in particular remain high, whilst unfortunately the maintenance loan in England is only set to rise by 2.8%. So we've estimated that students stand to lose out on around £1,500 a year as a result of loans not keeping up with rates of inflation. So we think there's an urgent need for government to increase the maintenance loan in England in line with inflation, and to consider reintroducing maintenance grants for the most disadvantaged students, and also to review the parental earnings threshold for support. which has been frozen at £25,000 since 2008. And that's meant that fewer students are now entitled to the maximum level of support. Yeah. So I'll stop there, but I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A session with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Hollie, and also to Lindsey. I've got a question initially, and then we'll move on to the commissioners after that, if that's okay. So I'd like to ask what work is being done at the university level to affirm that students who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and further facing cost of living crisis are able to access higher education and receive support. I know you've touched on that. I know you've both sort of touched on that a little, but I just wondered if you'd like to expand on that somewhat.
I don't want to be the university that pushes back and says the government point that Hollie just made is probably the most important point that anyone could make, which is that loans are not keeping up with the rates of inflation. And so we're at a time when everyone is struggling with the cost of living crisis, we're expecting students to live on significantly less income every year, which is, you know, universities can put money at this. We don't have a lot of money, but we're trying to put money, as Hollie's just described, through targeted funds. But the point is it's affecting everyone. And so, you know, universities are kind of limited in terms of how they can help people when loans are being squeezed so drastically. And this is just based on the fact that they're using historical out-of-date expectations of inflation rates to offer the funding levels. I think, you know, I also touched on the fact that universities are doing student access and success committees. That's the kind of work that's going on in the ground, and there's a lot of momentum behind these things at the moment, as I said, really focused on not just access but also retention. You know, our own COVID social mobility and opportunity study has highlighted, you know, beyond the cost of living crisis, there's also a massive mental health crisis as a result of the pandemic. You know, it's got a lot worse since the pandemic, and so things are very stretched on the ground, and students' experience is fundamental, but universities need some help too.
Lovely, thank you. Hollie, was there anything further that you'd like to add?
I mean, I kind of touched on cost of living. I think one thing I'd add to that is that government has just changed the repayment terms for students, and that has meant a real difference in the proportion of students that are going to pay back their loans in full, changed from 27% of students that will pay back to over 60% of students who will pay in full for those students enrolling this coming academic year. So there should be some savings there that the Treasury can use to increase maintenance support, and this is a loan and the majority are going to pay it back, but it means that there would be money in the pockets of students to help them during their studies in the meantime. And as well as being concerned around more students potentially dropping out of their courses, with more students taking on increasing amounts of part-time work, that also reduces the extent to which they can engage in extracurricular activities, which we know are really important for developing those soft skills that employers value. So that's a kind of another aspect.
And is it having an impact on dropout rate as well?
We haven't seen it yet, but I think there's going to be a lag in the data.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Okay, I can see we've got 3 of our commissioners waiting to ask questions. So I'm going to bring in Lara, then Neil, then Anita, please. Starting with you, Lara.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. I think the thing so when I went to university, first, you know, we were absolutely, you know, poor as you like. When I went to university, I honestly don't think I would have gone if the loan situation was in place at that point. You know, I didn't have to pay tuition fees, and I got some grant, and then I got student loans for the rest of it. And I wonder what evidence there is, if any, on what affects the tuition fees and the kind of structural system that we have now for going to university has had, you know, what effect that's had on people from more disadvantaged backgrounds choosing to go, or do people just not, you know, is it just kind of, well, let's worry about it later on down the line? I mean, I think the other thing linked to that is obviously apprenticeships are a really great opportunity to get a degree without going to university. And, you know, I suppose you know, that was about kind of, you know, a lot of that was, you know, aimed at kind of getting people into jobs, you know, where we have shortages and all that kind of stuff, but we're actually seeing an increasing amount of kids that would and could afford to go to university actually now choosing the apprenticeship route as well. And I just don't have a sense of how much of this the money thing has affected the kinds of kids that are going to university now. It's that point, really.
My colleague Jill Winus, who's the deputy director at the centre, has done a lot of research on this to show that the increase in fees hasn't impacted who's attending, primarily because it's a loan, right? And if you don't earn enough, you're not going to pay it back. I mean, Hollie's right; they've just changed, you know, the repayment terms. I don't know how aware people are of that nuance, in that you're far more likely to now.
It's a terrifying amount of debt, though, isn't it? But like you say, it is a loan, and you're sort of kicking it into the long grass a bit. Aren't you?
I mean, it's not coming through in the data. I think it's fair to say there's been steady increases across all socioeconomic groups in participation. The gap hasn't closed, but it hasn't widened it either.
That's really helpful, thank you.
But apprenticeships, obviously that's a really good alternative route. There's just not many of them, Lara. The apprenticeship levy is not being used in the right way. It's not being targeted to young people, and as a result, you know, it's being used for existing employees to get MBAs or whatever. So
I know, and I completely agree. And I mean, I think the other thing that we've seen is actually it's not just about the kids. You know, actually we've seen some older people who are changing careers who've done a really, you know, that's, you know, that's still leveling up. You know, we're giving people a profession, you know, and that for me is should be doing more of that. And I don't think employers do enough of those kind of older people at once, or looking at who you might have in your own organization who's doing a low skill job, but he's got the potential to do something more professional within your own organization. And I think we're missing a trick on that kind of thing.
Couldn't agree more.
Hollie, do you want to
just on both those points, I think it was almost kind of surprising when the policy came in for the 9250 fees that didn't impact students more, and kind of especially those from more disadvantaged backgrounds actually wanting to come. We didn't, as Lindsey has said, didn't see that drop off in appetite, and we've seen numbers grow. I mean, those fees have been flat for a number of years now, and of course have kind of lost their value in terms of the income coming through to universities. So that's created a situation where we've modelled that we're subsidising the cost per student of tuition now for domestic students of around £2,500 per year. So there's a question of sustainability here with university finances, that if that shortfall in funding isn't addressed, then that starts to limit opportunities for students in terms of the choice of courses that will be on offer, but also our ability to expand to meet demand, because we know that the number of 18-year-olds is growing, and to be able to meet that supply is a question mark all the time, that the funding situation isn't more sustainable. On the apprenticeships point, so 17 of our universities actually do offer apprenticeships, but the scale is very small. And one of the reasons here is actually regulation. Bit of a kind of niche point, but it's incredibly challenging to develop the courses, work with employers and getting those courses up and running. So regulation is a key barrier to expansion of those types of universities.
And Neil, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I would. I think Lindsey's absolutely right about the link between an education strategy and an industrial strategy. And I think that's been absent in British economic policy for far, far too long, and definitely in comparison to our friends, I tell you happily, in the European Union. So what I want to know is really, what does Lindsey think an industrial strategy should look like, which involves education? And I just pose these questions. Should it be focused on the regions that need industrial strategy most? Or should it be thinking more about the technologies and so forth in the future, which are linked to universities? Obviously, a combination of both is seen in an ideal world what we'd want, but I do think that's sort of the framework for a discussion about an industrial strategy.
Thank you, Neil.
That's a big question, Neil. No one's got it
Well,
right
we are
yet.
commissioners.
So I think obviously there needs to be, and I think this is probably why we haven't done it very well in the past, there needs to be some kind of vision for what are going to be the growth areas going forward, and then, you know, making the decision of, you know, where this should be located. And I think, you know, really we have to do both. We can't continue with everything going to London and the southeast. It's not sustainable. We know that. So there does need to be a focus on the regions that need it most too. And if we can somehow predict what are going to be the growth areas in terms of industrial strategy, and then, you know, incentivize the growth areas to be located in the regions that need it. But, you know, the thing that I think is always missing between the industrial strategy and the kind of education and skills piece is who holds the power in that certain area, right? To be able to be the link between all these different pieces. And I think that's why this kind of devolution agenda keeps coming back up the agenda, because people realize there's no infrastructure to actually hold the kind of people together that need to be together in certain places to bring all of this together. I mean, there's a lot of amazing work going on in colleges, and, you know, there's some talk now of colleges and university partnerships, but then they also need that real strong link with local industry, you know, future plans in that area, so that they can be providing the skills that are needed. You know, I'm thinking about this kind of green net zero kind of discussion for 2030, and, you know, you sit in a room and ask politicians that are kind of talking about these things, have they got a skills strategy to support it? And they were like, no, someone tell me how we do this. So that's fascinating, right? Like, I think that the thinking is still being developed into what does that system design look like to enable us to bring the two pieces together, to ensure that the skills supply is going to meet future skills demand, and that it is distributed more equally in places that really need that support. I'm not sure I gave you a very good answer there, but it's the best I can do.
I was nodding furiously there, Lindsey. Hollie, did you want to add anything?
Just a quick thing, so I think Lindsey put that very well, but I think one of the main problems, is this kind of lack of strategy and the long-term strategy. And we've got the local skills improvement plans, which should be doing some of this, but from what I understand, they all kind of sound very similar. And there's no kind of they're not forced to kind of specialize depending on the strengths of that region, and therefore they all look broadly the same. So just not being very strategic about where our strengths are regionally and developing those.
Thank you. Thanks, Hollie. Neil, do you have a follow-up, or are you happy with the responses?
I'm really going to agree with both Lindsey and Hollie, because I just don't think the structure's in there at all. And I would point to, say, Germany with their grade bodies, which are compulsory and comprehensive, and so on. I think that's what we lack. I also think we lack businesses who are willing to really integrate with the education world. I think they pay a lot of attention to it, but they don't properly integrate. And I think we need to find ways to get that done. So if this commission is going to make a difference, I think it needs to address this question.
Thank you very much, Neil. And somebody, Charles Freeman has entered onto the chat. How should LSIPS address this need? I don't know if anybody.
I think Hollie spoke about that. You know, these are really generic. These are the LSIPs, right? So these are, local skills improvement plans are just they don't seem very specific to what we need in terms of specific areas, but.
Thank you. Thanks, Lindsey. Okay, Anita, do you like to ask your question?
Yeah. During the presentation, there was a comment about students' ability to actually have the full university experience, and that made me think very clearly how one thing that's changed is the number of young people who stay at home throughout their university experience. And I'm wondering whether there's any data about this cohort that maps on to their outcomes and in terms of what degrees they're awarded, whether they stay, and what sort of jobs they go into. And if there is any data about whether they come from more disadvantaged areas or within a local area, whether that is the case. Because I think that's an interesting dynamic about the choices that people make and about where that takes somebody.
Thanks,
A really
Anita.
interesting question, Anita. Lindsey, I don't know if you're aware of any data on this, but
Yeah, I know a little bit, but if you've got stuff to go first, you should
go first then.
Are you sure? So we know that we know that of students who attend local universities who stay within, stay at home, essentially stay within X miles of where they come from. Low SES students are more likely to attend the post 92, and high SES students are more likely to attend the Russell group, regardless of how similar their prior attainment is. So we know that there's some kind of barrier there in terms of the views that people from different backgrounds have of how they would fit in different institutions. I mean, I lived in Bristol for a while, and I can completely understand this because, a lot of the people that were from Bristol would not consider going to Bristol University. They would go to UE. And that was very much related to the kind of outside attitude of what Bristol University students were like. So I think role models and how you would fit definitely feels an important part of this picture. And it's something we actually need to do something about. I think a lot of universities are kind of aware of that and trying to break it down a bit, but a lot of outreach and kind of partnerships with local schools, I think, would help in that area. In terms of outcomes, we know that generally graduates are more likely to move for work than people that don't go to university. They are more geographically mobile. We're just starting a project now where we're going to be looking at whether this varies by the socioeconomic status of individuals. But I think that when you piece it together with what we know about where people from different backgrounds go when they stay locally, I expect that what we're going to see is that it's high SES graduates that are doing most of the moving. And this does have an impact, obviously, on opportunities because you've just got a wider range of options available to you as part of that. That's probably the best I can do on that.
Thanks, Lindsey. Hollie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a few couple more general points. I think there's been a number of kind of pressures in recent years, and one of them has been availability of accommodation. That mean that more students are having to travel long distances potentially, or they're not doing that and they're choosing to live at home and then just commute in on a couple of days a week to the campus. I think also COVID and the way teaching is delivered has impacted some of this. So during COVID, everything was, a lot was delivered online. And though everybody's back on campus now, there is this expectation from students to have more flexible ways of learning and to have recorded lectures, etc. So I suppose that allows students to live at home and commute in or live in different cities, potentially. So there's more flexibility there. But it does come with the trade-off that they potentially aren't as kind of integrated into the university community, taking part in those extracurricular activities that can be important for both soft skills, as I was saying. And something else that we've seen in recent years is a real increase in demand for mental health support. And I think that, when students aren't necessarily kind of properly integrated into the community, then they might fall through the net of our universities being able to help them and provide that mental health support, which we know is increasingly needed. There was actually some data published last week showing that 30% of undergraduates starting courses this academic year will have a history of missing education due to mental health needs. So yeah, it's really prevalent, and it's an area that our universities have been really expanding their services. But one of the issues is reaching the students that need it, and if they are studying remotely, then that's more challenging.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you a further question from the pre-submitted questions. What are some of the social and cognitive emotional challenges faced by students who do not find adequate opportunity in higher education, and how can these be mitigated and effectively addressed by institutions?
I can have a go at this. I mean, I think I briefly touched on some of these in the last answer, which is thinking about a bit about why people might struggle in certain places, and the importance of role models and mentors, like we saw in the Universities UK report, for making people feel like they belong. I think that there's a lot of good outreach work that can happen to not just get people in the door, but also when they're there, to link them up with people who might be able to support them in a good way. But we also know that prior attainment is a little part of this story too. So I just wonder if there needs to be more of a link up with schools and local areas to really support and encourage students who might not otherwise have considered participating in university, to really kind of explain to them the importance of what they're doing at school, for getting over that barrier. We did a report for Nuffield Foundation a couple of years ago that showed that students that studied A levels were less likely to drop out than students that were studying BTECs and technical qualifications. And our takeaway from that isn't get rid of BTECs, which they shouldn't be doing, obviously, but maybe there needs to be more support for the people that are studying on these courses to help them transition. You targeted support when they enter university to identify them as a group of students who might just need a little bit more guidance in terms of the elements of the university courses that are not the same as what they've been doing previously, to really kind of ensure that they are feeling like they can carry on in their studies beyond what they're doing.
Thank you, Lindsey. Hollie, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I am. Just to expand on the kind of mental health support, I suppose, because this is such a significant area for universities. I think the thing that's difficult is getting the right support to the students at the right time. And we've got a network of mental health practitioners who kind of come together and share best practice. But it seems that where it works best is where it's done in partnership locally. So, for example, we've got the Universities of Manchester have come together with the local NHS to deliver a dedicated mental health service that's funded by all parties. So students are able to get the medical help they need. And then that allows the university student services to focus on those kind of lower risk cases and wellbeing concerns. And we've also got examples where universities have really kind of invested in buildings where you've got kind of cafes and library facilities, but the counsellors and the social support and the career services all coming together in one place, so that students are kind of exposed and they know what support is available to them, and then they can access that support that works in the best way for them at the best time.
That's great. Okay, I think that concludes the end of that particular session. Thank you to Lindsey and Hollie, our superb expert witnesses. And can I just reiterate to everybody that there is an opportunity to send in written evidence to us using the email address that's in the chat function. So thank you both. And like I say, you're welcome to stay if you'd like to, or alternatively, we understand that you're very busy people. So thank you.